Mm. Oh, dust allergy. Okay, okay.
Dr. Ranjan there? Afsar?
Hi, sir. Ranjan sir has told me to ask you to start so that he'll come in a while.
Okay. Dr. Karthik, should we start?
Sure, no problem. We can start.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure that today we have Dr. Karthik to speak to us on how to read and how to interpret clinical trial results. It's an important facet of learning process. So it will not only help you in your examination, reading articles, and throughout your medical career. So Dr. Karthik has kindly agreed to speak to us. So over to you, Dr. Karthik.
Thank you, Dr. Iyengar. I'll just share my screen for a moment. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Dr. Ranjan. He's been asking me to talk to all of you for a very long time now because of this COVID. We weren't speaking, and now we do it online. So this is some sort of a small short presentation that normally I give to our fellows here, cardiology fellows here. So I just thought that you may also find it useful. So this is something which we'll just sift together. We just look at some important trials. These are not very recent. These are in the last couple of years, but these are big trials. And often so remember that what I try to tell our students is that clinical trials are not there just because somebody is doing them. It's because these are the things which actually guide clinical practice. So all your practice in cardiology has ultimately derived from large clinical trials. So it's key that you try and understand what each trial result means and how you interpret them, how you apply them to your patients. So I'll try and give you, so the whole topic, I've made it in such a way that there are only two messages in this whole presentation. But before we come to that, I just want to start off by looking at a few trials. So the first thing that one needs to remember is that one swallow does not make a sum. So remember that whenever you look at any trial result, it should not automatically change practice, because changing practice rarely comes from one single trial. It usually is the result of incremental accumulation of evidence. So in keeping with this, we need to understand how to interpret trial results in the context of prior evidence. So one way of looking at it is prior probabilities, more objectively. So this is just an example of, we'll talk about it in a different context a little later, but what it means is that if you see the data, if you look at, say, you have a trial result, it produced a relative risk reduction of 0.75. So that means the HR was 0.75. And if you draw a distribution around it, so this is the, so this is the distribution around that. And if you look at what the prior evidence was, depending on, supposing there were, all trials were negative, so more or less this was the hazard ratio, which means close to null. So this is the, this blue one is the prior distribution. So if you were to interpret the current trial result in that context, you will end up with something like this. So you have to, so it doesn't mean that automatically 25% relative risk reduction means that it will produce 25% relative risk reduction in your population. If you look at the entirety of the evidence, it may actually not be so remarkable. So this is just a general principle for you to remember. So we will talk about it a little more in detail later on. So let's start off with one trial. So aspirin for primary prevention, this trial, as all of you may know, was published a couple of years ago. This is the ASCENT trial. So just to summarize, this was a large trial, 15,000 patients or so, and it was a primary prevention trial. These were all diabetics, and the primary outcome was any serious vascular event at 7.5 years of follow-up. This was done by the Oxford group, and these are the main results that they presented. So these are the outcome results. So this is presented in the form of a forest plot. I'm sure all of you understand how to interpret this. We don't know. Other thing is, if anybody doesn't understand something completely, or I need to stop somewhere, please indicate. Please let me know so that we can stop and we can try and understand better. So these are the forest plots for the primary outcomes. So you will see that the primary outcome of any serious vascular event, which includes TIA, was reduced with aspirin. So it was a relative risk reduction of about 12%. If you see, this is the 0.88 risk reduction of about 12% relative risk reduction. But also, you will have to notice that there was an increase in any major bleeding, which was about a 30% increase, relative increase in major bleeding, which was also about a 1%. So if you see here, when you look at it, you always look at the absolute risk reductions as well. So this was an absolute risk reduction of about 1% in the major vascular events, and there was an absolute increase in major bleeding of about 1%. So it was a perfect trade-off. If you think about it, there was a 1% increase in bleeding, major bleeding, and there was a 1% increase in any serious vascular event. So if you look at it in this context, it would make sense to say that there was really no net benefit of taking aspirin for primary prevention, even among the population which is considered at high risk for major vascular events, which is the diabetic population, elderly diabetic population. Now, like I said, the first thing you have to look at is whether the previous evidence is consistent with it or not. So if you were to look at the previous evidence, so this is the results of the other trials which were published along with it. So you'll see that these were also consistent, the ARRIVE trial. And so if you see, there was a 0.88 relative risk reduction of about 12% again, and there was a similar proportion of increase in major bleeding as well in these trials. So this is all very consistent with all the recent trials of aspirin for primary prevention. So overall, you get a consistent picture. There's an increase in bleeding, which is about 1% absolute risk increase, and there's a relative risk or absolute risk reduction of 1% in major vascular events. So this is balancing each other out perfectly. So there is no net benefit of aspirin for primary prevention. So this is something which we wrote about in Indian Heart Journal. One of our fellows wrote about in Indian Heart Journal also. So you can read that. This is discussed in more detail. So having done one trial like this, so we can, you'll understand that it's easier to go about it like this when you look at the next trial. So this is the SGLT2 inhibitors for diabetics. We're not talking about heart failure. We're talking about diabetics at risk of CAD. So these were the original SGLT2 trials. So we'll look at the DECLARE-TIMI trial, which used dapagliflozin, and it was a non-inferiority trial, large trial. And remember that about 30% of patients had coronary artery disease. Rest of it was a primary prevention population, and they had composite outcome of MACE and a composite of CV death, hospitalization, or heart failure. Follow-up period was about 4 years. So these are the results, again, presented as a forest plot. So if we had a classroom sort of atmosphere, I could have asked somebody what this means, but anyway, we'll go on. So here you'll notice that, so there are, so currently journals have a different way of, so if they just present the p-values for the primary outcome for which the study was powered. So then after that, it's done in a hierarchical manner, whether the other outcomes are different or not. And they don't provide p-values because there is a question of multiplicity involved. So we can talk about that if we have time. But so consider that the primary outcome, which was cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure, was significantly reduced, about 17% relative risk reduction, about a 1% absolute risk reduction, and at 4 years. So this was significantly different, but they did not present p-values for the other differences, some of which were quite remarkable. So one of them was the death from the reduction in EGFR, which was, so it was very renoprotective, and this was a large effect, but despite that, they did not present p-values because it was, like I said, it was a hierarchical testing, and they did not present p-values because of multiplicity. So, so now here we know that we have to look at two things. One is the primary outcome itself, the benefit, which was for which the trial was powered. And then we have to look at the other outcomes, which incidentally turned out to be significantly protected. So we need to look at the other trials. So you know that there were two other trials. So if you put all of them together, this is the meta-analysis of all three trials, which is published in the Lancet afterwards. So you will see again that for the MACE outcome, there was a consistent reduction in the, like we saw, it was about a 12% reduction. Again, there is a 14% reduction, which is consistent with the overall declared TIMI results. So all the three trials are trending in the same direction. So this was a significant reduction. So this is consistent with what we saw in the declared TIMI 58 trial. But there is one small hitch here. So when they look only at the people who did not have CAD, so these are in the primary prevention population, MACE events were not really reduced. So that is something which you can get when you look at the entirety of data. These are all, this is not just prior evidence. This is actually what is called an individual patient data meta-analysis, where all the individual patient characteristics and outcomes are available for the authors to club together. So that is slightly different from when you have a different trial where you just have the trial results to go by. Here you have all the data, so it can be put together in a much more efficient way, so that you can get you can make more sense of the data. So that was for MACE. So when you look at the heart failure hospitalization or CV death results, this is remarkably protective. So this is across the board, all the three trials, like we saw earlier, they are protective, and this is irrespective of whether the patients had heart failure or they did not have heart failure. So this is an important result. It's consistent in all the three trials, and it is present irrespective of whether the patient had heart failure before or not. So there was one which we saw, which they did not provide p-value. It was a large reduction in renoprotective effect. So presence of renal worsening or ESRD or renal death. So if you see, all the three trials are producing the same, almost similar magnitude of effect. You see, the magnitude of effect was about 45% here, and it is similar in all the three trials. And overall, the results are consistent. So this is seen both in patients who have cardiovascular disease and in the primary prevention population as well. So this is indeed a very big effect. So it is also consistent among all the three trials. So that although in declared TIMI, they were unable to be very certain about the effect, when you look at the entirety of evidence, it is very clear that the SGLT2 inhibitors have a big renoprotective effect. So this is the importance of looking at trial data in prior evidence and looking at all the evidence that is available, so that you can make a better sense of what the data are saying. Now, this is slightly more complicated. So if is it generally clear to everybody? Is there anything that we need to clarify before we go on to this one? One of you can be the spokesperson for the others. If there are any comments, you can put it in the comments box also.
I think we'll take at the end also if there are any.
Sir, we couldn't hear the previous slides because of the disruption of the agent. Can you please explain, sir, what thing we will see in that, which to focus on about the percentage which will favor the treatment and which do not?
Okay, which just the last slide, or this is? Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, sir. Now we are able to hear you.
So you want me to explain this last slide or even before that?
Last slide.
Even last slide also will be okay, sir. Okay, sir.
I think there is one question, sir, regarding hazard ratio they want to know.
Go on. What is the question?
Explain more
Okay,
detail about the hazard ratio.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the question?
Sir, they want to know about the hazard ratio. Hazard ratio.
Okay. What about the hazard ratio? Hazard ratio is just it's just another risk ratio. So if you say 0.7, that means there's a risk reduction of 30%, or 0.3 is a risk reduction. It's the same. It's just called hazard because you're looking at the ratio of the hazards. If you look at the ratio of the risks, then it is a risk ratio. So consider it as just a risk. It's just a risk. So you just have the risk of the outcome, the primary outcome in the numerator for the treatment, and for the risk of the primary outcome in the placebo group in the denominator, and you take a ratio of that. So that is what is the risk ratio. Hazard ratio is just one more form of risk. That's all. So it's not very different. So think about it as a risk ratio. So it just means that there is a relative risk reduction of 1 minus that much. Is that clear?
Yes.
So what I was trying to tell you is that just hold on 1 second. So what I was trying to tell you is that we need to look at the whole body of evidence when you draw conclusions from one single trial. So for the SGLT2, we just looked at the declarative E58 trial. So what I was trying to show is that we need to look at the totality of evidence, which means all the other three trials, all the other 2 trials. So putting all the 3 trials together, we can see whether the results were in the same direction, whether they were consistent or not. So in a sense, what we showed was the relative risk reduction, which is the hazard ratio, was similar across the board for all the 3 trials for the primary outcome. And the heart failure hospitalization and cardiovascular death, which is one of the new findings in the SGLT2 inhibitor trials, was also consistently reduced in all the 3 trials. And so this is a finding which is not a chance finding. If you find it in only one trial and you don't find it in other trials, then it could be that it's a chance finding and you need more data to be sure about it. But here, you know that all the 3 big trials showed the same, essentially similar reductions in heart failure hospitalization and CV death. And this was seen both in patients who had a history of heart failure and those who did not have a history of heart failure. So the other point that I was trying to make was that sometimes in a large trial, when you look at multiple outcomes, 1 or 2 of them may be simply positive or negative. There might be an increased risk or reduced risk simply by chance. So that is why the p-value was not given in that first trial, in the first slide that I showed you. So we need to look at how this particular outcome fared in all the other trials. So when you look at it, so essentially what we see is that all the trials, all the 3 trials, which of the SGLT2 inhibitors produced a consistent reduction in the renal outcomes as well. So this is not a chance finding. It's likely that this is a true finding. So this is one of the most important findings that came out of the SGLT2 inhibitor trials. So the point that I was trying to make is that you don't go by the results of one trial. You always look at the total body of evidence available. Okay. So all this while, it was pretty easy because we had large trials and we had trials which all trended in the same direction. So you may remember this trial which looked at icosapentethyle to reduce coronary events, which was a large trial which was published just about a year ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. You're familiar with these trials, right? We're not talking about some obscure trials, correct, Dr. Afzal?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, so REDUCE-IT was a large trial. You know that there has been a lot of talk about these fish oils and things like that for a very, very long time. So REDUCE-IT looked at one particular derivative of this, and in a large trial, and among people with elevated triglycerides. It was a 5-year follow-up, and you know that this is a purified form of icosapentaenoic acid. So the primary outcome was a composite of cardiovascular death, non-fatal myocardial infarction, non-fatal. So whenever you see a large composite, it means that the event rates are going to be very small. That's why you need a large composite. Otherwise, you'll not be able to show the trial will not be adequately powered. So remember this when you look at very large composites which have multiple individual outcomes. So now what did this trial show? So these are the Kaplan-Meier curves. You know again that there was a 25% risk reduction. So hazard ratio of 0.75 means the hazard ratio in the icosapentethyle arm, the risk hazard in the icosapentethyle arm was this much. The hazard in the other arm, or the placebo arm, was something. So if you take a ratio of the two, you know that it was only 0.75 of the hazard in the placebo arm, which means it is a 25% relative risk reduction. So that's what the hazard ratio here means. So this was for the primary outcome, which we saw was a very large composite. And this is cardiovascular death, MI, or stroke, which is also significantly different. Now, when you look at the hazard ratio, do you anybody wants to when you look at just the hazard ratio, is there any other additional bit of information that you need to interpret a trial? The results of this particular trial. We're not talking about the data as such, but when you look at one particular trial, you say that we said that the hazard ratio is 0.75, which means it's a 25% relative risk reduction. Do you need any more information? Will you look for any more information? It's usually there in the paper. Anybody wants to answer that?
Dr. Karthik, would you like to comment on the placebo that was used in this trial?
Yeah.
The mineral oil, they said it might interfere.
Yeah, so that is an explanation of the trial results. So what I'm only trying to just look at the data. So we can interpret the trial results in that context also later, but I'm just trying to give a sense of how to interpret whatever is presented. There may be other physiologic reasons, pharmacologic reasons why a particular trial result is like this, but just trying to get a sense of how to interpret these results as they are presented.
Yeah, that's okay, fine.
So anybody wants to take that question? So we said hazard ratio.
Confidence intervals.
Okay, so confidence intervals are presented together with the hazard ratio. So for example, here you can see that 0.75 means 0.68 to 0.83. Any other bit of information? Especially when we started off, we said that this is a very large, very complex composite. It has 5-6 components. Okay, hold that thought. We will come to it. So the question we should ask ourselves when we see so 25% relative risk reduction is generally a good relative risk reduction. It's not extreme, but it's reasonable, and this is what most trials are powered for. So based on these results, should we change our practice? Because this is not a very straightforward question, because it has been many studies have addressed this. So we need to interpret the results of these trials. So here it is a little more complex, like I said before, because the trial results prior are not very clear. So it's critical what it doesn't sound very objective, but it also depends on what you believe. So like Nietzsche said, there are no facts, only interpretation. So we need to look at what we believe. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So we saw this graph earlier. So what I'm trying to tell you is that supposing you thought, you looked at all the data that are published prior, and you will notice that you can interpret that all the previous EPA trials were all negative, except for one, that was the Japanese trial, which is called JELIS. So you can say that in a sense, if you put all the results of the previous trials, so the prior HR here, this means the hazard ratio in all the data that happened prior to reduce it. And if you look at it, if you say that every trial was negative except one, so if you combine all of it, you can actually assume that it was nearly a null result, which means EPA did not have an effect. So that is your prior belief. It can be your prior belief. So if you interpret it in that context, if you interpret the current data is this. So which is a 0.75 risk reduction. So if you interpret it in that context, if you put both of them together, you will end up with a result, which is the dotted lines here. So which means that we thought it was a 75% or 25% risk reduction, but in a sense, it could be as small as a 5% risk reduction. So that is one way of looking at it. The other way, if you believed otherwise, so it could be that you can say that so this is where Dr. Iyengar just pointed out one aspect of the trial, this Reduce-IT trial, where they used a different mineral oil, which could have actually affected the placebo adversely. So, or affected the placebo in the same direction, so that it could have affected the treatment, it could have reduced the treatment effect, or it could have acted in several ways. So in that context, if you were to look at it, so you can say that purified EPA, this is a trial which is completely different from all previous trials. High dose was not used in most previous trials, except the JELIS trial, which I told you, which was the only positive trial. So if you look at it in that context, then you will say that the prior data, prior HR is maybe close to one, because you don't have any data prior. So this is what people call a non-informative prior. So you assume that there are no previous data. So you can say that, okay, previously there's only one trial which looked at high dose EPA, and most of the trials do not apply in the context of reducing. So if you were to look at it in that way, then after combination of whatever you know, the posterior HR, that is what you interpret with after looking at the current data of Reduce-IT, it becomes closer to the trial itself. So it is still not as good as the trial, but it's probably closer to the trial. So it's about a 20% relative risk reduction. So these are two different ways of interpreting when you don't have sufficient information in the past. So the last two trials that we looked at had sufficient information in the past from good quality trials, all of them looking at the same agent. For example, aspirin means 75%, the 75 milligram of aspirin every day. So that has been used extensively, and it has been studied extensively. So we don't need to think of the previous trials as being different. But here you can actually think that, okay, previous trials used lower dose, they did not use purified forms of EPA, and so on and so forth. So you can think about it in those terms, and then you can interpret it in that context. But coming back to the question that I asked you in the beginning, so remember that when you look at just the relative risk reduction, it doesn't tell you much. So supposing you had an event rate of 5-year event rate of 1%. So if in the placebo arm, in the treatment arm, if it became 0.75%, you'll have an HR of 0.75, which means it's a 25% relative risk reduction. But actually, if you look at the absolute risk reduction, it's only 0.25%. So that is not something worth writing home about. So you have to remember to look at the absolute risk reduction as well. It could be a large relative risk reduction, but if the baseline risk of the population, like in REDUCE-IT, was very low, then the absolute risk reduction may be very, very small. So it was much less than 1% per year. It was about 0.6 or 0.6% per year, a risk reduction, absolute risk reduction. So in absolute terms, it does not really matter. So you can look at all these things and then you can decide whether you need to, how you need to put it in your clinical practice. So that is one part of looking at prior data. So is that clear, or do we have any questions, clarifications? Anybody?
I think that was very clear for all of us. Could go ahead. Again, if they have any question, they can note down.
Sure. So I'll quickly go to the second part of the presentation, and we will then we can just have a small discussion at the end if there is time. So this is another famous trial. So all of us are faced with this problem of whether we should do routine RF ablation for atrial fibrillation, or we should treat them with drugs, rate control, rhythm control, and then do RF ablation later. So this trial, surprisingly, this question was not answered before, and the only trial which looked at this was the Cabana trial, which was published again just about a year ago. So this included, for an AF trial, this is a large trial. For an AF ablation trial, this is a large trial. 2,200 patients, 4 years of follow-up, and they did pulmonary isolation or any other procedures that were required, and they were performed by experienced electrophysiologists who are experienced in RFA for AF specifically. And the primary endpoint was a composite of death, stroke, serious bleeding, or cardiac arrest. So this is something which is considered important in patients with AF, and so this was the primary outcome. So when I say this is the COURAGE trial of electrophysiology, you will understand why I say this. If you don't understand it now, you'll know it once we've finished this. So remember that this is a strategy trial, just like COURAGE was. You all remember COURAGE, right? COURAGE was a trial which looked at a strategy of initial revascularization for patients with coronary artery disease compared to initial medical therapy. It does not mean that you don't do revascularization in the patients who have medical therapy, who are on medical therapy. It's just that the strategy is initial revascularization. So here again, it's a strategy of routine RF ablation for patients compared to a strategy of initial medical therapy, followed if necessary by RF ablation. So that is what the strategy means. So it reflects clinical practice. So when you do such a trial, remember that you need to do an intention to treat analysis. If you don't know what an intention to treat analysis is, it's simply that you analyze patients as they were randomized, irrespective of what they were treated with. You analyze them as they were randomized. Supposing a patient was randomized to RF ablation, and he did not get RF ablation because of whatever reason, he will still be analyzed as part of the RF ablation group. So that is the point of intention to treat analysis. This is required because the whole point of randomization is that all prognostic variables that may contribute to the outcome differentially are all balanced perfectly between the two arms. So if you deviate from the intention to treat analysis, then these variables again become differentially distributed, and then the trial results are not unbiased. So that is why you need to focus on the intention to treat analysis. So if you look at the intention to treat analysis, they found that the primary outcome was not different between the two groups. It was not statistically different. So, but the thing that some people would like to always point out, that about 27-28% of patients randomized to drug therapy underwent ablation. So the temptation is to do an analysis which is as treated, or in some forms it's called a per protocol analysis, but remember that it's an as treated analysis. So it seems to make sense that you do an as treated analysis, but remember that the moment you deviate from any analysis other than the intention to treat, you introduce bias. So for example, if I can tell you, so somebody who was randomized to RF ablation could not get RF ablation because of, say, he had a very large LA, or his ablation was not successful because of some difficulty. He would be, and he did not undergo RF ablation, if you put him in the medical treatment arm, you are actually biasing against the medical treatment arm, because he's one of those patients who in any way wouldn't have had RF ablation. So try and understand that whenever you do anything other than the intention to treat analysis, the baseline variables will become different between the two groups, and they will no longer be comparable. And it's not a random change, it is a systematic change. It's because some people are resistant to taking drugs, for example. So they will do badly in whichever group they are. So they are systematically different from other patients. So you will introduce bias, and the bias is not, you cannot adjust for that bias in any way. So remember that if you do an as treated analysis, you may find a difference, but it is not robust because there are biases. So this is the chart that gives you the difference between the intention to treat analysis, which is the ITT analysis, and the as treated analysis. So you'll see that while the intention, yes. Okay, I thought somebody said something. Okay, so you can see that while the intention to treat analysis, the differences were not significantly different between the two groups. In the as treated analysis, everything was quite different. So the per protocol analysis, the primary endpoint itself was significantly different. So it's remember that whenever you look at the any strategy trial, it's important to look at the intention to treat analysis. So the conclusion from Cabana should be that an initial strategy of RFA does not appear to improve outcomes in patients with AF. Okay, so there is another twist to this, because what about higher risk patients? So this was specifically tested in another trial. All of you may remember the CASTLE-AF trial, which looked at atrial fibrillation in patients with heart failure. So this is essentially a small trial. It's a 360 patient trial, and they looked at heart failure worsening outcomes as the primary outcome. So they did routine RF ablation in these patients, and they treated the other arm with medical therapy, and they found a large reduction. So you'll see that the hazard ratio is quite large. So it's 0.62, which means it's a 38% risk reduction, which is, like I said, 25% to 30% is something which is considered modest, and most trials will power for that. But when you find very large risk reductions, you must always be a little cautious. So it was a large risk reduction. And they also, to their surprise, they found a large reduction in the risk of death. So all cause. If you see, this is a 53%, 47% risk reduction in death. So which is quite unusual, you can imagine. So can you think of any treatment in today's world which reduces death by half in any condition? So it's very surprising. It's a surprising result. So whenever you have surprising results, you should be very cautious in interpreting. So the risk reduction, as you see, when we in the previous trial, we said when you look at relative risk reduction, we also look at absolute risk reduction. So absolute risk reduction is 12 to 14%, so which is a really large risk reduction. 12 to 14% is a large risk reduction for any outcome. So these are surprising results. So we should ask the question, how this could have been, is this really true or not? And can these should these results change your practice? So I want to introduce a small concept here, which is called the fragility of a drug. So look at the So we said this is a very small trial. This is about 300 odd patients. Number of events is also small, and they lost a significant number of people to follow up, and it was differential loss to follow up. More patients in the RFA arm were lost to follow up than the usual care arm. So you look at this table carefully. So you remember that when we look at difference in events between the two arms, you can see the number of events. So if you see, say this is for the primary endpoint, this is 51 events here and 82 events here. So remember that whenever the number of events is small, there is even simply by chance, you can have a distribution of events which is differential between the two groups. So in a smaller trial, and when the number of events are small, the chances of this happening are higher. So people have calculated something called the fragility index, which means that what is the number of events it takes for the trial results to change completely. So for example, for this outcome, the fragility index is 11. So if what we are trying to say is that if 11 events had occurred in the other arm, so the trial results would have become null, would have become completely neutral, which means RF ablation wouldn't have been found to be useful in patients with AF and heart failure. So the fragility index for the primary outcome, which you remember was a composite of 3 or 4 things, is 11, which is not a very large number. So in a trial of heart failure patients, you follow them up for 3 years. If 11 events had occurred in the other arm, then the trial would have become negative. So you can imagine that if the number for the fragility index is very large, then the trial can be considered more robust, not fragile. So think about the surprising finding that we looked at, the death from all cause result. So you'll see that the fragility index for that is 5, which means that in a heart failure population, if 5 events had occurred in the other arm by chance, the trial result would have been null. On the other hand, just with 5 events, the risk reduction was about half. So it's a very surprising result, but you must remember that when the fragility index is so low, you should think that chance is an important possibility. So you should think of fragility of a trial whenever the number of events is small and the patient population is very sick and the number of events is small. So the second point that I wanted to highlight here, the first point being that you should not change your practice based on just one trial. The second point is that you should always consider chance as an important influencer of trial results, especially when the results are small, when the trials are small. So just to give you an example, this is a collection of the large trials, heart failure trials, because most of the heart failure trials have large number of events. So which is why they are more robust. But even in that, there's a big range. So if you see, these are all old trials. You don't have to remember the name, but remember that if you see the number of deaths in this column, so it ranges from 46 to 1,000. So you can imagine that, and you look at the fourth column, fifth column, you'll see that the relative risk reduction is all large. So whenever the small number of events is small, you can simply by chance, you can get large relative risk reductions, which is again, like I said, whenever you get very large relative reduction, you should be cautious. You should immediately suspect that it could be chance. So this is what happened with say the earlier trials, which was subsequently shown to have no benefit. So you'll see that when the number of events is small, the relative risk reduction is very, very large. And look at this, when the number of events was very large, the change is not so remarkable. So, and this is probably a much more robust result, much more reliable result. So this is something which you need to remember. So chance can be an important influencer of trial results, and you should, particularly when the trial is small. So just to summarize, this is, I think, enough for today. So what have we learned so far when interpreting trials? 2 things, I think. never interpret the results of a trial in isolation. Always consider prior evidence. Sometimes prior evidence is much more clear, like we saw in the aspirin trial and the SGLT2 trials, where it's easy to combine the previous trial results and all of them are in the same direction. But sometimes it's difficult, like in the EPA trials. So, but still you need to make an effort to include the prior evidence in your interpretation of the trial results so that you can make changes to your practice. Other important thing is whenever you look at trial results, always look at the number of events. Whenever the number of events is small, you have to consider the possibility that chance has played a part. And this is particularly true when the trial results are too optimistic, like you get a large reduction in death, 50% reduction in death, which is not consistent with any treatment that we have seen in the last 50 years. So that is something which needs to be looked at with suspicion. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to highlight there are many more things, but this is something just a starter. So in terms of the practice of cardiology as such, from whatever trials we've looked at, I wanted to summarize by saying that aspirin is not useful for primary prevention from whatever evidence we have reviewed. SGLT2 inhibitors prevent MACE, heart failure, and renal events in diabetics with CAD. Prescribing high-dose EPA will depend on patient preferences and cost, because we saw, although there is the benefits of EPA are there, and depending on your prior look at the evidence, they could be modest or they could be very small. Ultimately, because the absolute risk reduction was so small, it would your decision to prescribe icosapentathil will depend on the patient preferences and the cost. Icosapentathil is extremely expensive. EPA in general was not very expensive, but this was a purified compound, so it is expensive. So you have to consider all those things in making your decision about whether you use this molecule at all or not. And finally, a strategy of routine AF ablation does not improve outcomes compared to standard treatment. So that's all I wanted to talk about. We can if you're interested, we could discuss something if there is time. Dr. Afsar, is there time?
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Karthikeyan. Extremely good talk, and thank you for taking out some time. And now I think I've learned a lot from you. I'm happy that the whole group is able to listen to you. So any questions? I think we can open the forum and
regarding the superiority trial, even one single trial, is it enough for the change of practice? And I just wanted to know the strength of the trial depends on the number of subjects included in the trial, absolute reduction, or what are the other factors which determine?
So whatever we talked about in terms of superiority or non-inferiority, it does not depend on whether a superiority trial it gives more information than a non-inferiority trial. That's not generally true. All trial results have to be interpreted in the context of prior evidence, irrespective of whether they are superiority or non-inferiority. There are more issues with non-inferiority, but that is a topic for a complete discussion because there are several issues with that. But it does not matter whether it's a superiority trial or a non-inferiority trial. It has to be interpreted in the context of prior evidence. The second thing you asked was about absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction. So these are important things to consider whenever you try to translate evidence to practice. So like I said, in the icosapentathil trial that you said, the relative risk reduction was about 25%, which just looking at it in isolation seems like a modest risk reduction, which is what you get with statins, for example. Statins for secondary prevention will reduce MACE events by about 25%. But the important thing to consider is in the REDUCE-IT trial, the absolute risk reduction was less than 1%. It was about 0.6% per year. On the other hand, if you look at the statin trials for secondary prevention, although the relative risk reduction is only about 25%, the baseline event rate in the placebo arm could be as high as 10%, which means that it translates to a 2.5% absolute risk reduction, which is worth it. Whereas it may not be worth it when you consider just the small absolute risk reduction. So it's important to put everything together.
Yeah. Thank you. Because some of the trials have definitely changed. Even a single trial, I think ARNI trial, it changed the practice.
Okay, so that's an important point that you're bringing out. The ARNI trial is important because if I did show you the table in which we looked at some heart failure trials prior. So the ARNI trial is a large trial and it's a very robust result.
Yeah.
So the number of events is very, very large.
Yeah.
So for the results of that trial to change towards null, you need a very large number of events to change. So that's why this is one of those trials which has changed practice based simply on one trial, because it is a large, robustly conducted, large event trial. So it's a very robust trial. It's not a fragile trial at all. But having said that, we are talking only about the methodologic aspects of trials when we are interpreting. Like Dr. Iyengar pointed out, there are some other issues that you need to, for example, in REDUCE-IT, the placebo arm was treated with a mineral oil. So there are several issues which come out of that. So similarly for the ARNI trial, PARADIGM-HF, people have argued that, for example, so many trials have run-in periods, for example. So PARADIGM had a run-in period. What they did was they treated everybody with the ARNI in the beginning, and they included only those people who tolerated the ARNI. So that is a very, very important thing to remember. So if you were to translate the trial results to routine clinical practice, you will find that many patients do not tolerate that dose of ARNI. So that is an important takeaway. So when you interpret the trial results of PARADIGM, you have to say that these trial results apply to patients who tolerated ARNI. So that may not apply to your real world patients. So if they tolerate, fine. If they don't tolerate, these results probably do not apply to them. So there are several issues here. So we just focused on the methodologic issues. So there are other issues that come into play when you actually translate to clinical practice too.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Very good talk.
Any questions from students?
I think there are some questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
So Dr. Karthik, one question is from Deepak. Inferiority margins, how to decide as it influences the results?
Yeah, so that is non-inferiority trials are complex designs. So that requires a whole new. So non-inferiority margins are. So there is no objective way to say what is the right non-inferiority margin. So it can be, it is decided on so many factors. So, so the only thing I can tell you briefly is that when you look at a trial, you look at the non-inferiority margin, and you ask yourself the question. So, for example, offhand, I can think of, say, let's think of the PRECOMBAT trial. PRECOMBAT was a trial of PCI versus CABG for left main disease. So it was a non-inferiority trial, and they used the non-inferiority margin. It's in the New England Journal. Anybody who's interested can go look at it. So the non-inferiority margin was a very large margin. So what essentially it means is that you are willing to accept an increase in adverse events. So the outcome is, say, supposing death, MI, revascularization, which is usually the outcome. If the non-inferiority margin is set at, I think it was set at some 7% or something, which is what it essentially means is that you're willing to accept a hazard or a handicap of 7% in the primary outcome, and still you would consider your treatment, interventional treatment, as non-inferior. So that is the thing that you're saying by setting the non-inferiority margin at. Supposing you say non-inferiority margin is 1%, you're essentially saying, okay, if it was more than 1%, I'll say it was, if the death or MI revascularization more than 1% compared to CABG, I'll say, okay, treatment is inferior. But if it is less than 1%, I'll accept that it's non-inferior. But on the other hand, if you say you're giving a non-inferior margin of 7%, you're saying that, okay, even 6% increase in death, MI, and revascularization, I'm willing to consider PCI to be non-inferior to CABG. So would you would you think in clinical practice that is acceptable to you or not? So that is a question that you have to ask yourself when you're looking at non-inferiority margins. So it's a complex thing. There are several ways in which FDA asks people to set non-inferiority margins. So that is a whole different discussion. But in general, this is the question that you need to ask yourself. I see some more questions in the chat box.
Yes. One is a follow-up question, I think, Dr. Karthik. One is that by Dr. Badri. What decides superiority or non-inferiority trial? It looks like a follow-up to what you just do. Yeah.
Okay, so generally, non-inferiority trial is so whenever you look at non-inferiority, you try to compare it with some standard existing practice, number one. And you're doing non-inferiority because you think the new treatment has some advantages over the previous treatment. So for example, classic non-inferiority is, say, for stroke prevention in AF. So if we were using VKS, and you're trying to show non-inferiority of the DOACs against VKS. Now, why is that? Because VKS are standard treatment, but VKS have some definite disadvantages: inconvenience of INR monitoring, inability to keep target INR. So these are issues, and which are probably not there with DOACs. So in that sense, you can say, okay, DOACs do exactly the same thing as VKS, but they do it with much less inconvenience. So it is sufficient to show non-inferiority. You don't really need to show that they are better. You can say, okay, even with a similar event rate, you're willing to accept DOACs because they provide distinct advantages for clinical care. So that's the classical reason why you do non-inferiority compared to superiority. Similarly with stents, you have seen that people have used every new stent is looked at non-inferiority against the Xience V platform. So Xience V was considered the standard stent. So you don't have to show, it's very difficult to show incremental superiority with newer technologies in terms of clinical outcomes. So you just want to say, okay, if you're as good as Xience V, it's fine. And you should not show any worse outcomes. You have advantages in terms of deliverability. You have advantages in terms of side branch protection. You have so many advantages. But as long as it is as good as Xience V, we are willing to accept non-inferiority. So that is why non-inferiority is a good way to do these trials. So that is the reason you do non-inferiority.
I think some of these trials, cardiovascular outcome trials with anti-diabetic drugs, I think initially they wanted them to be non-inferiority. So some of them could start with non-inferiority, but still during the study, it might prove to be superior to the other.
Yeah. So that's just a statistical adjustment. So for example, the DOAC trials also, the general principle is the same. The principle is that the newer treatment offers some advantages over the older treatment, and you're willing to accept a small handicap, or you're willing to say that if it is just as good, you're okay with it because this has advantages. But if you power your trial adequately, then you can say, okay, if I show non-inferiority, then I will test for superiority as well. So sometimes you find that the new treatment may be superior to the old treatment, which is a bonus, which is good. So there is this one more question. Is it unethical to design a superiority trial with a standard treatment previously? Okay. No, it's not unethical to design a trial which, if you believe that the new treatment may be superior, you can. It's just that you may not end up showing superiority. So what happens is if you do a superiority trial and you don't show superiority, then the conclusion is not that the two treatments are equal. It simply means that you are not better than the previous treatment. So you're left nowhere. So which is why people do a non-inferiority trial in which even if you're not better than the previous treatment, if you are within the old treatment within a set non-inferiority margin, you can say that, okay, we are not worse off than the old treatment. So you have a definite result. Your conclusion is that you're not worse off than the older one. So you can actually use this treatment also. So that is.
And Dr. Karthik, are the equivalence trials different from this?
Yeah, equivalence trials are generally they are bioequivalence trials. So basically, see, non-inferiority trials, you look at one end of the margin. You are
Yes.
saying that. So see, this is actually a complex thing. I will not
No,
be able to make you
I
understand.
understand.
So
Yeah.
bioequivalence trials are looking at complete similarity, which means that they should not be better, they should not be worse off, and they are also not better off.
Yes.
When you look at two, so this is typically done for two molecules, for example. Bioequivalence is done for, say, serum levels of one statin versus the other, or a generic statin versus a standard established statin. You want to look at, not statin, maybe you look at some other drug, antibiotics, maybe. You look at serum levels. So serum levels have to be both within one set margin, both sides of the 95% confidence interval. Whereas for non-inferiority, you look only at a broad one end of the non-inferior 95% confidence interval.
Thank you, Dr. Karthik. And I think with all these questions, we may have to, if you're free sometime in future, we could have one more talk just on these things: non-inferiority, inferiority, and equivalence trials.
Sure.
There's one more question, Dr. Karthik.
Which is the better NNT?
Yes.
Okay, but NNT is a very simple concept. You know what an NNT is. Whoever asked this question, NNT is simply the inverse of the reciprocal of the relative absolute risk reduction. So if you have in the treatment arm, if you have an event rate of say 5%, and in the control arm you have an event rate of 4%, the absolute risk reduction is 1. So the number needed to treat is 100. So that's what it is. So the number needed to treat when it is low, it is good. It means that you need to treat fewer patients with the new treatment compared to the old treatment in order to achieve the same results. So the number needed to treat is smaller, it is better. But again, it depends on the outcome. Supposing it is death, then it's great. It's very good if you have a very low number needed to treat. But if it is some non-specific outcome, like, I don't know, some non-objective outcome, then the number needed to treat doesn't really have that much of value. But it's essentially the reciprocal of the absolute risk reduction. It would vary differently for different outcomes, clearly.
Thank you, Dr. Karthik, for your time, and I'm sure we'll get back to you at some point and learn more from you, Dr. Karthik. Dr. Iyengar, would you like to?
Just want to thank Dr. Karthik. I think we are less fragile now after your talk. Trial results. Thank you very much. We learned a lot, and we hope to see you more often and clear more of our doubts. Thank you, Dr. Karthik, for sparing your time.
Thank you, Ranjan. Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure. Thank you.